Hey friends, what's up? I thought in today's video we would look at the new Svelte 5 changes and compare them to the older version of Svelte using this component party site. Recently I started to get more into Svelte 5 as I feel the release is closing nearer, but you're going to see based on these examples how awesome the new version of Svelte is. Alright, so without any delays, let's get started. Alright friends, so let's start with reactivity. You probably all know and love this syntax in Svelte 4. We can say let name equals John, and then we can use reassignment to update a value in Svelte. Easy peasy like that. But in Svelte 5, oh no, what is this? $state. Oh, this looks a lot more complicated, right? But actually there's a couple of reasons why this is like this. So we're using these runes which are just signals, and this really makes things a lot simpler, and when you write code you're going to see later how awesome it looks like. But basically the reason runes exist is in Svelte we had two reactive systems. So we had this kind of reactive system in the Svelte component itself, and then you probably used or at least heard about Svelte stores. So if you're using some code in another file, you would have to use a different reactive system, and this will get really confusing, a lot of things to know about. But in this case what you see here is the same way how we use reactivity inside Svelte components and outside Svelte components. So this already makes things a lot simpler. So if we go to the Svelte 5 REPL and see here, it's really simple, same as before, count equals $state, and there are a couple of runes. You have the derived rune and etc, and we can just increment the count here the same as before. Easy peasy like that, friends. So we can see the updating state, so we can use reassignment here, which is really awesome. And we can also use reassignment in Svelte 5, so nothing changed here. But another thing that these examples don't tell you, now in Svelte 5 you no longer have to reassign. So in the past, if you had something like, let's say, array, if you had something like these numbers and etc, and then when you would want to reassign this in Svelte 4 and previous versions, you would have to say array, and then you would first have to spread the old values, and then you would say new values. This is no longer the case in Svelte 5. In Svelte 5 you can just reassign the value and Svelte is going to know to change it. So how awesome is that, friends? So that's really something beautiful. This is the same true for arrays and objects, and this is something I really love about Svelte 5. So in Svelte 4 you're probably familiar with this label $ syntax. So you say label and double count, so Svelte is going to see this and is going to know to update this because it saw count here reference, right? But there's really a problem with this, because when you have a function and use these values inside, the Svelte compiler can't see this because the reactivity happens at compile time. But when you're using signals, this gets a lot easier and everything is so much clearer what is going on, because you have this specified rune. So you have state, we have count here, then you have double count, we just say derived, and you can use an expression here. And there is another rune where you can do more complex things inside, you can pass a function, but derived just accepts an expression, and this is really simple. So now when someone else looks at the code, they don't have to understand this weird $: syntax, they can just see the derived rune and this works as expected. So if you use this value inside of another function, now you have runtime reactivity thanks to signals, so things work more as expected. And I also want to mention that there's some confusion around this $ syntax, what this replaces, right? Some people think that they have to, there's this new rune effect, so you can use this. And people think, oh, this is React, but no, it's really nothing like React. You're not going to run into the same foot guns. You don't use effect to run updates, you use the derived rune, because actually how we had this $ syntax, this doesn't just translate to this effect. So for example, how you would say console log value in the past, you would use effect for this, for example, or for side effects, the domain, etc. But when you want to compute some value, you just use the derived rune, and that's basically it. And in the case of console log here, there's actually a special rune in Svelte 5. Inspect, you can pass it a value, and this is really more advanced and helpful, and you also don't have to worry about removing it because this only works in development. So that's really awesome. Alright, so let's say for example you have this count component and you want to extract it into a reusable component which you can use inside other files, right? So let's reuse this increment function. I'm going to name this counter. And now simply as that, we can just move the state inside of this function. So we can do it like this, and then we can keep everything here. Let's just rename count to value. You're going to see why. And then we can just return whatever you want. So I can say return, and then let's return the value, and let's also return an increment function. So this is going to be value plus equals 1. And then we have to create this counter. So we can say count counter. And this is an example. You would have this in another file, so you would create a .svelte.js or .svelte.ts file, and you would have the same reactivity system in those files, right? So this completely replaces the need for stores. And now we can just say count. So this is why I named it value, otherwise it would be awkward, count.count, right? And then we can say count.increment. But there's something interesting. This doesn't work. And why it is, and this isn't even related to Svelte, this is just JavaScript. We're requesting a stale value from the function. Like, this can't be magically reactive when we request it, right? So there's a couple of things. We can return this as a function, which we can invoke. So we can invoke it like this, or we can use a getter and setter in JavaScript, right? So this isn't anything specific to Svelte. And then we can say get value, and then we just return the value. That's it. So we can go here, and now it's completely reactive, as you can see. This is really simple, but this can get tedious because now you have to use getters and setters, and the Svelte team saw that problem, right? And they made proxy state, which means that your state is reactively nested by default. So here's how we can fix this, for example. And now we can go here, we can turn this into an object, and now we can say, for example, initial, and we can pass in the initial value like this, just enhancing the example, right? Nothing special. And then we don't have to even think about getters and setters anymore unless you want more control. So now, because this is deeply reactive, arrays and objects are by default deeply reactive in Svelte 5. So this is just going to work as expected. And let's actually rename this value. So this is going to be value. We're going to pass the initial value. And now let's rename this to count. So this is going to be count. And now you can even destructure this and it's going to work. So we can destructure count, increment. And now we don't even have to use this. And we can also say count.value. So it's going to reference count.value here. Oh, and of course I need to change this count here. So I have to say count.value. As you can see, you don't have to think about this anymore. So there's another thing you can do. You can even use classes in Svelte 5. So for example, if we create class counter, and here you can also use state. So for example, we can have count equals state, and then you can just use a constructor. So you can use anything you want. You don't have to use classes. You can use functions, classes, and etc. depending how you prefer to abstract things, right? And then we can say initial, and then we reference this count, initial, or whatever else you want. So what the Svelte compiler is going to do when you use a class like this is going to create the getters and setters automatically. So for example, if I say const example, we can say new counter, and let's just actually see. Actually, I don't even have to do this because we can go at the output. Let me just code this over. You can see what happens here. So this is what the Svelte compiler does. It has this class and it creates a getter and setter. But of course, you can do this yourself if you want, but this is how Svelte 5 makes your life so much easier, encourages you to use classes and etc., which is really a great way to encapsulate some logic, but it doesn't force you into this. You don't have to use this. You can see we can use a class, we can use a function, we can use deeply nested reactivity here, so we don't have to think about getters and setters, or you can use getters and setters if you want more control. Alright friends, so I hope you're already excited about Svelte 5 because I am. When I think about doing some state, I don't have to do some mental gymnastics, right, with colon equals, and I'm like, okay, is this how it's going to work? Is this predictable? No, I just slap a derived, or I use the reactive value somewhere, and it updates as expected. And this is such a joy to work in. Alright, so we looked at the computed state. Here's a templating example, nothing new here. We can look at the styling here, and I don't think there's anything different here, right? So it's the same as before. So let's look at loops, and nothing is changing here. Good old each loop works as expected, right? So let's look at events. And this is something really awesome in Svelte 5. So if we can look at the Svelte 4 example, we just say let count here. Of course, we're using this good old rune here. And now you can just increment the count. But if you can notice, there's something different. In Svelte 4, we use on, colon, click. But in Svelte 5, your event listeners, like on, click, and etc., are just attributes, right? And this is really awesome because you can just pass this to your component, you can spread your event listeners, and this makes things so much easier, not only for library authors and maintainers, but just for regular people that use Svelte, right? This is really so neat. Unfortunately, you lose some conveniences. For example, you might be familiar or used that pipe symbol, and then you would say prevent default. You can do that here with this new system. You just have to use it inside the function, but the trade-off is worth it in my opinion. Alright, so let's see this example. So DOM reference, you need to reference a node. As you can see here in Svelte 4, we have to import onMount and then we can reference the element. So we assign it using bind this input element, boom, easy peasy like this. But in Svelte 5, this is even better because this replaces effect. This is what I told you before. Don't think that the effect is just a replacement for that $colon because it does actually different things. This is used for side effects like the DOM and etc, right? And this is even simpler because we don't have to import these runes even. These are just compiler hints, right? These runes, if I didn't told you already, these aren't some functions, even they look like functions, but they just tell the Svelte compiler what to do. So you can see we didn't have to import anything here. We can just bind this, same as before. Now we can use this effect. When this component is mounted, this is going to run, and now we can focus this element. So this is basically how you reference an element. Alright, so this might look like a lot of code, but I don't know why they made this convoluted example. So this is basically just showing conditionals, right? Which I don't think anything changed. So this is really, there is really nothing different here except this event handler, right? This is on colon click. This is just on click. So I don't think there's even anything to look at this example, except of course the reactivity here. So here we're using this $, and here you just say $state. You say derived, boom, and you don't have to think about it anymore. It's just going to update as you expect. All right, so let's look at another example. So Lifecycle again. So this is actually the example. So here it is side effects, zone manipulation, right? So here we're importing onMount. We have this variable page title, which we're going to update. So this is reactive like this. And then we say onMount inside, and then we're going to update the title. But in Svelte 5, we just use an effect for this, and that's basically it. So nothing complicated. And then we can see things like onMount. So for example, here we have to import this onDestroy, but you can also use onMount in Svelte 4 and return a cleanup function, I think. So here defining time, here is this simple timer. So when this component gets unmounted, we're done. We don't really want this timer to persist, right? So we can use onDestroy and then we can clear the interval. But in Svelte 5, we can just use this reactive state rune. We can declare the date, and now inside of the effect, we have this timer, and then we can just return a cleanup. I'm not sure why these examples are different. I'm pretty sure that you can just use onMount and return a cleanup function. But yeah, as you can see, this is just an example. So we can look at component composition. So here we're creating this user profile component. There is not a lot different here, I think. Let's see. Yeah, there is nothing different here. I think this wants to show you the props. Yeah, exactly. So we can see here, this was a bit weird in Svelte 4, and not because just of the syntax. What annoyed me really in Svelte 4 was how difficult this was to type, right? And you would have to do some weird things if you wanted to type these things all at once. So you'd have to use export let for the props and etc. Really doesn't matter, but look how simpler this is in Svelte 5. And we can see instead of using export let for props, there is literally $props rune. And now you can destructure your props. You can pass in a generic here as a type. You can type these things all at once. How beautiful is this? You can get res props and etc. And this is so much better in Svelte 5. So those are props. So let's look at emitting events. So here we have some events. So answer button. So when an on yes event happens, then we want to invoke on answer yes. And on no, we want to invoke on answer no. That's basically simple like that. And you maybe never use this, but this was really something I loved about Svelte 4, and it got even better in Svelte 5. But there was this clunky API, right? Create event dispatcher, then you have to create dispatch, and then on click yes, you would dispatch this. This is just a custom event listener, right? So nothing special here. But in Svelte 5, things are so much easier. So you can see here we have this on yes. I think that's a convention. You have to prefix this on yes and on no. They invoke these functions. We don't really have to think about this code. The actual interesting part is here. So look how much simpler this is. We don't have to create this clunky event dispatcher. We can just use the child prop, so we can destructure on yes, on no, and then we can say, okay, on click, invoke this, on click, invoke this, boom, bam, thank you, ma'am. That's how easy that is. Isn't Svelte 5 amazing, friends, right? All right, so let's continue. So slots are gone, or at least they're going to be supported at some point, but they're going to be gone in the future. So here we have this function, and then you can pass in anything here. So in the past, you would say slot, and that's it. But in Svelte 5, here we have this interesting render thing. So you can destructure children from props, and then you can use this render. And we have this render because some other features like snippets that you're going to look at later. So you can say render children, boom. And that's how you use it. Slots are gone. And this is such a way more powerful system. It's a bit more verbose than the other one because in some instances you have to check if you have children. I think if you're using... yeah, if you don't have children, then you have to check for it. Otherwise, you're going to get an error when you could just slap a slot in and that will be it. But you're going to see through your use of Svelte 5, this is so much more better. So we can look at this example of a slot fallback. So no quantify. Oh yeah, this is the example that I was talking about just now. So we can see how this looks like. So if you have children here, you actually have to check if children, then you render them, else no content found. Otherwise, I think you get an error, right? But you can see here, it's really not intimidating. It's really a great improvement. All right, so let's look at the context here. And context, if you aren't aware, it's just really an easier way to pass some data for your components to avoid prop drilling. So for example, if you have component ABC, and if you have to pass the same piece of data using props, that would be really annoying. So you can just define something in the context in the parent or the top component, and then you can just use that piece of data, function, whatever else in the child component. So let's see what this example is showing us. So it's showing us how it uses stores here, right? So create user store. Okay. So this is it. So this is something that you also could do. You could use context with stores, and then you could just use a store so that it's scoped to that component. Otherwise, if you just use a store without context, anything else that uses it is going to change that store, right? So you're going to run into problems. So basically, you're using context plus stores to scope it to that component, right? So you can see here, it shows us get context user. So here it creates user stores. It creates a store writable. Then it creates this store, right? And then let's actually see, create user store, set context. And this is the store that it imports from create user store. And now it's going to put it on this context, because by default, when you just pass a value in context, it's not reactive. So using a store is for this reason, to make it reactive. Okay, but let's see how simple this is in Svelte 5. So again, they're using context, nothing is changing here, right? And you can see there is no store here, and it looks so much simpler, right? Because we can just use the same reactivity system, create user state, boom, there is no store, there is no weird things you have to know about it, right? You just use $state, and then you just return and you get username. We can even make this simple. Remember how I showed in this example. You don't have to do this. You don't have to set getters and setters. You can use this deeply nested reactivity. You can use a class, and you can avoid having to do this. So this would be a lot cleaner if you use what I showed you before. So as you can see, stores are gone. Bye-bye. I love this new reactive system. Alright, so here we have some form inputs, and there really isn't anything special here. It's just showing how it binds this value of text to input. And the only difference is, of course, here we're using let text equals hello world, but here we're using let text equals $state. So basically, that's really it. And we can see, so this is the form input section. We can see checkbox. We can also use state like this, and there is really nothing different about binding this value and etc. It works the same as before. So here we have radio buttons, and again, the only difference is that we're using $state. And you can bind the group and etc., which you can learn from the Svelte tutorial if you've never done this before. But yeah, you can see the same here with select. You just use $state, and then everything else is the same. So you can use bind value, select color ID, and etc. So yeah, it's really not that different. Alright friends, so let's look at web app features. And in Svelte 4, everything was a class, and this isn't something you should be concerned about because you use Vite or SvelteKit to scaffold your project, right? So this just showing we have this app.svelte component. So here is how we raw doc Svelte, so we can import this app component. We can say const app equals new app and just pass a target, and that's it. This is how simple it is to use Svelte. But in Svelte 5, everything is a function. So if we look at this component, it's the same as before, but inside app.js, we import this component, and then we import this mount function. So now we say const app equals mount, and then we pass as an argument the app component and the target, and that's basically it. So this isn't anything that we should be concerned about. But let's look at another interesting example. So in this example, it shows you how you can use fetch in your Svelte component, but I don't think a lot of people are going to use it because you're probably using SvelteKit and their data loading patterns. You should really avoid fetching inside your component unless you're building a single page application or something. But as you can see in this example, here the structure is loading error and data from this kind of like React looking hook thing, use fetch users, right? So it just encapsulated this logic inside. So it looks really nice like this. So if it's loading, then it shows something. If error, then it shows an error. Otherwise, if there are users, then it's going to display them. And it's really something interesting. So of course, this uses stores in Svelte 4. So you can see it has a writable. It creates just this function use fetch user. It creates this reactive data error and is loading variables, and then here is some function where it fetches the data, and then it just updates this live, right? This is why this is reactive, and it just returns them. So this is how you would do it in the past, use a store like this, and that's really neat in my opinion. I love stores. But in Svelte 5, this is even easier, right? Because again, we can see this examples use fetch user, so this is the same as before. You can see not a lot is changed here, otherwise it's not using a store, of course, it's using runes. And this example is a bit weird. They're using class because I think when they made these examples, deeply nested reactivity wasn't a thing, but you can see here they use fetch users, and they create a new user response. So they're creating a class here. Remember how I told you that the Svelte compiler is automatically going to create the getters and setters for this, and this is the reason why they're using a class here, but you don't have to use this. Again, let's remind ourselves that we can just inside of a function use this deeply nested reactive piece of state. We can just use this, pass in an object and etc. And then we don't have to use a class or anything else. So if you're thinking, oh, I have to use classes in Svelte 5, no, that's really not true. You can just use this deeply nested reactive state here. And then the rest of this is the same as before. It just fetches the data and returns the response. So now you can use this the same as before. This is really great. You don't have to know about this syntactic sugar, because you can see here, this is $is loading. So now you first have to explain to someone, okay, first, listen, this is a Svelte store, right? And to access this value, you have to use this syntactic sugar $. So this is going to automatically subscribe and get the value from the store. No, none of that in Svelte 5. This just looks like regular JavaScript to me, which is reactive, right? So you can say if response is loading, then fetching users and etc. If you get an error, show the error. Otherwise, show the users. How beautiful is this, friends? And I think that's basically it. So I'm not sure why they're showing links here for the router link in Svelte 4. I guess with SvelteKit, right? But there's really nothing different here. There's the same, and here is something for the routing, but I don't think there's any changes here. But yeah, that's basically it, friends. So when is Svelte 5 going to get released? And this is just my guess, actually, so really don't take my word for it. There is this site, is Svelte 5 ready yet? So I'm going to link all this in the description if you want to look at it. And it's actually pretty close if you look at this test, and we can see what's left to be done, right? But actually it looks really close to release. The API is locked in. I think there might be some changes, right? Because it's not released, of course. But actually my prediction is that Svelte 5 might be released, or the release candidate at least, at the next Svelte Summit, which is April 27 this year. So you can see it happen in spring. Alright, friends, but that's basically it. If you like what you've seen, don't forget to like and subscribe, and you can also support me by becoming a patron. Thank you for watching, and catch you in the next one. Peace.